Have you ever wondered how exactly you would conduct UAS operations in U-space airspaces? What does a UAS operator have to do to be permitted to fly in a U-space airspace? Is it enough to simply download an app and take off? In today's episode, we will take a look at how U-space is supposed to work according to the regulation. At the time of this recording, not a single U-space airspace has been established in Europe, even though the U-space regulation has been in force since January 2023, so for more than 2 years already. And even though we still don't know how U-space is going to work in practice, the regulation at least gives us an initial idea. And it is precisely on the basis of the regulation that we are going to take a look at what UAS operators have to do in U-space airspaces in order to conduct their UAS operations. And to make it all a little clearer, I have 2 examples for you. Example number 1. Roof inspections. Drones are increasingly being used as a tool by roofers. In the past, a roofer would need a ladder or scaffolding to inspect a roof. But nowadays, more and more often drones are being used for this purpose. With their help, inspections can be carried out faster and with less danger to personnel. So, how would a roof inspection with a drone in a U-space airspace probably be performed? A customer calls and an appointment is made. Now the roofer could sit down at his PC and first research where the customer's house is located, what the roof is like and whether a drone could be used there. Or, as is much more likely, at the appointed time the roofer arrives at the customer's place, has a look around and spontaneously decides to use a drone. For the sake of this example, let's say this is a typical commercially available drone with a takeoff mass of around 700 grams. The operation is performed in the open category. Therefore, our roofer is obliged to always keep the drone in sight, ensure that current weather conditions are within operational limits, not exceed a height above ground of 120 meters, and maintain a safe distance from uninvolved people. Because our roofer is the decent sort, he opens one of the respective apps before flight to check whether there are any UAS geographical zones in the area. Lo and behold, his research reveals that the house is located in a U-space airspace. At this point, let us assume that our roofer already has a chosen U-space service provider that offer their services in this U-space airspace. Otherwise, the scenario would end at this point. Why? Because the registration process is pretty time-consuming. More than one U-space service provider or USSP can offer their services in a given U-space airspace. This means that a UAS operator would have to get an overview of eligible USSPs, then compare them with each other, and finally choose one to their liking. Every U-space airspace has an associated Common Information Service Provider, or CISP, that provides information on USSPs that offer services in the respective U-space airspace. Other important information that can be obtained from the CISP is requirements that the drone is obliged to meet in order to be operated in that U-space airspace. Once an operator has decided on a USSP, they must conclude a contract. In addition to the usual registration process, providing and verifying contact information and a valid means of payment, the parties must also agree on how information will be exchanged. For example, the UAS operator, in this case our roofer, must be prepared to transmit information such as the UAS operator registration number or the position of the drone to the Network Identification Service. This means that the UAS operator would first have to check whether their drone is actually capable of supporting the required protocols. Only when all these requisites are met can a UAS operator actually use the U-space airspace. But back to our use case. So our roofer has determined that the customer's house is located in a U-space airspace. In order to fly, our roofer must first obtain a UAS flight authorization from their USSP. To do this, they use the provider's app, enter the customer's address and define an area around the house in which the drone is to be operated. After that, they specify the expected duration of the flight and probably tick a few boxes before they can submit the UAS flight authorization request. Upon receiving the request, the USSP checks whether other flight authorizations already exist that conflict in time and space with the requested operational volume. This task would be fully automated, so an immediate response can be expected. While our roofer is waiting for feedback from the USSP, they prepare the drone and upload the operational volume to it. Since the drone will only be operated a few meters above the building, there will be no conflicts with other flight authorizations, and the USSP authorizes this flight. Our roofer is now carrying out some final checks on their drone. As soon as they are ready to take off, they activate the UAS flight authorization. The drone is only permitted to take off after the activation of the authorization has been confirmed by the USSP. However, there is an alternative for our roofer that lets them avoid the red tape of USpace altogether. Certain operations of certain drones are exempt from the USpace regulation and therefore will not require a US flight authorization even in a USpace airspace. And I'm skipping over some of the details here, but essentially this boils down to using drones that weigh less than 250 grams. Let's move on to our second example, the transport of medical goods. Let's assume that we have a blood bank at location A that supplies hospitals with blood products and uses a drone for transport. The flights are carried out by a logistics service provider. Such flights usually take place beyond visual line of sight of the remote pilot, also known as BVLOS, and are performed in the specific category of operations. This means that the logistics service provider must first apply for an operational authorization from the competent authority. Based on the flight route, the ground and air risk are determined and mitigated when necessary. If the application is approved, then, in accordance with EU Regulation 2019/947, the logistics service provider has operational authorization to fly this route. If the route is in a USpace airspace, the logistics service provider must still obtain a US flight authorization from their selected USSP before each takeoff, as in our previous example. So how would this example work in practice? The logistics service provider receives an order from the blood bank to transport blood bags to a hospital 10 kilometers away. This is a well-known route that has been approved by the competent authority. The logistics service provider uploads the flight route to the USSP's app, selects a time period and the latest possible takeoff time, completes a few details and submits the request. As in our roofing example, the processing of the data should be automated so that a response will be immediately available. Let's assume that our logistics service provider is lucky and that there are no further US flight authorizations in the desired area at the desired time. The next step is to prepare the drone for takeoff at the specified time. Before that, the weather conditions are checked again to make sure they are within operational limits. As before, the logistics service provider still has to activate the flight authorization. After receiving confirmation from the USSP, the drone can then take off. This is how it should work. However, our first example with the roof inspection should generally work out without further complications. Our roofer sends a US flight authorization request to the USSP. USSP authorizes the flight. Roofer activates the US flight authorization, waits until receiving the confirmation of the activation of the US flight authorization, and finally takes off. Since the operation takes place very close to a building, it is unlikely that there would be conflicts with other US flight authorizations. In our logistics example, however, it is likely that there would be an interference with operations. What kind of complications could possibly arise, you might ask? Unlike locally confined operations, flights over longer distances are more likely to overlap with other flights in terms of time and space. This means that when requesting a US flight authorization, there is a realistic chance that the desired airspace has already been booked. In this case, the USSP would have to reject the request. However, the USSP would have the option of making counter-proposals. For example, they could suggest a different time or a different route. Well, theoretically. Because in the case of an alternative route, the USSP must consider that the UAS operator may not have the necessary degree of freedom to implement the counter-proposal within the scope of their operational authorization. But even if a UAS flight authorization is granted, there is still a possibility that the flight cannot take place as authorized. For example, a dynamic airspace restriction, meaning a temporary closure of airspace, could pop up along the route at short notice. When operating in controlled airspace, the responsible air traffic control unit could initiate a dynamic airspace reconfiguration. This happens when a manned aircraft is going to pass through a USpace airspace. Outside controlled airspace, manned aircraft are also allowed to use U-space airspaces, provided they make themselves electronically conspicuous. In this case, UAS remote pilots would be required to monitor traffic and take action as necessary to avoid any collision hazard with manned aircraft. This means that a US flight might have to be discontinued. Another reason why drone flights might not be carried out as authorized is if flights with a higher priority request a conflicting flight authorization. Usually, the first-come, first-served principle applies when requesting US flight authorizations. However, there are exceptions to this rule, namely when it comes to special operations. These include police and customs operations, traffic surveillance and pursuit missions, environmental control missions, search and rescue, medical flights, evacuation, and firefighting. In our example of transporting blood bags, it would most likely be considered a medical flight and would therefore take priority. However, for operations that do not fall into one of these categories, their UAS flight authorizations would be withdrawn if a conflicting request for special operations were submitted. And finally, there is weather. If weather information services are provided in a U-space airspace, the USSP would be obliged to check whether the weather minima and maxima specified for the U-space airspace are being adhered to on the basis of the meteorological information provided. If this were not the case, the USSP would also have to withdraw flight authorizations. This was an overview of how drone operations in U-space airspaces will presumably be carried out in accordance with the regulation. How it will all work out in practice later on and whether interruptions to flights or the withdrawal of US flight authorizations will be the rule rather than the exception remains to be seen when the first U-space airspaces are established. Until then, we can only speculate. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye!